The particular silence that settles over a recording studio at 2 in the morning is different from the silence of any other place at any other hour. It carries the weight of everything that has been attempted in it and not yet achieved, the accumulated presence of takes that almost worked and arrangements that needed revision and voices that had given everything available to them and still come up short of the thing they were reaching for. And Frank Sinatra knew this silence well enough to recognize its different qualities, the way a sailor knows the different qualities of wind, knew the silence that meant the session was done, and the silence that meant the session was stuck, and the silence that meant something had just happened that everyone in the room was still processing. And the silence in Studio A at Capitol Records on the night of September 22, 1959, was the third kind, the processing kind, and it had been in the room for approximately 45 seconds following a playback of a take that Frank Sinatra's arranger, a man named Don Costa who had been working with Frank Sinatra for 2 years, and who had strong opinions about what constituted a finished recording, had described before the playback as the best thing we've cut tonight. And after the playback, the silence had arrived, and Frank Sinatra was standing at the center of it with his hands in his pockets looking at the floor, and not at the control booth glass, where Don and the engineer were waiting for his response. The recording they had just heard was a version of a song called "The End of a Love Affair," and the song itself was not the problem. The song was fine, was in fact more than fine, was the kind of song that made other songs feel slightly less interesting by comparison, and the arrangement Don had written for it was clean and sympathetic, and gave the lyric room to breathe in exactly the way a good arrangement should. And Frank Sinatra's performance on the take they had just heard was technically accomplished in every measurable way. The intonation was correct, the phrasing was intelligent, the emotional register was appropriate to the material, and none of this was what was wrong with it. And what was wrong with it was something that Frank Sinatra could feel but had not yet found a way to articulate, was something in the space between what the recording was and what it should have been. A gap that he could hear, but that everyone else in the room appeared to have missed, because they were all waiting for him to say yes. That's the one with the expectation of people who believed they had finished something. Frank Sinatra walked to the intercom button and said to Don and the engineer that he wanted to take a break and that they should go get coffee and come back in 30 minutes. And Don started to say something about the hour, and Frank Sinatra said 30 minutes. Gently but with finality, and the control booth emptied and Frank Sinatra stood alone in Studio A with the microphone in front of him, and the music stands arranged in the arc that the orchestra had occupied, and the chairs pushed back to the positions where the musicians had left them when they finished their parts 2 hours ago, and he stood there in the specific way he stood when he was working through something internally, upright but not rigid, hands still in pockets, chin slightly lowered. And he was not thinking about the song in any analytical way, but was instead trying to remember something. What he was trying to remember was an evening in Hoboken in 1935, when he was 19 years old, and had gone to see a singer perform at a club that no longer existed, and whose name he could no longer remember with certainty. A singer who was not famous, and would never be famous, but who had done something that evening with a very ordinary song that Frank Sinatra had spent 24 years trying to understand and reproduce. Had done something that made the room go so quiet that you could hear the ice in people's drinks. Had done something that was not about technique or arrangement or any of the measurable qualities that could be discussed and improved and refined, but was about something else, about the specific willingness to be entirely present in a song rather than to perform a song, to let the song use you rather than to use the song. And Frank Sinatra had understood even at 19 that what he was witnessing was rare, had understood it viscerally before he had the vocabulary to describe it, and what he was standing in the empty studio trying to remember was not the song the man had sung or the specific notes or even the sound of the voice, but the feeling in the room when the performance was happening, the particular quality of collective breath-holding that a room of people produced when something true was occurring in front of them. The problem with the take they had just cut was not that it was bad. The problem was that it was exactly as good as it looked on paper and no better, was the performance of someone who understood the song thoroughly and was executing that understanding with precision, was the kind of recording that satisfied everyone's professional standards and that left the listener with respect for the craft and nothing else. And Frank Sinatra, standing in Studio A at 2 in the morning, knew that respect for craft was not what the song was asking for, knew that this particular lyric, which was about the specific exhaustion that follows the end of something that mattered, required something more exposed than craft, required the willingness to let the song be true rather than the willingness to perform the truth of the song. And he had not yet found that willingness in any of the takes they had done that evening, because he had been managing the performance rather than inhabiting it, had been making decisions rather than simply being in the room with the material and allowing the material to make decisions through him. When Don Costa and the engineer came back from their coffee 30 minutes later, they found Frank Sinatra sitting on the floor of Studio A with his back against the wall beneath the microphone, not doing anything, not looking at anything in particular. And Don looked at the engineer, and the engineer looked at Don, and Frank Sinatra said from the floor, "I want to try one more take, and I want you to do something for me." And Don said, "What?" And Frank Sinatra said, "When I start singing, I want you to turn the booth lights off. I don't want to be able to see your faces." And Don said, "The booth lights don't affect the recording quality." And Frank Sinatra said, "I know they don't affect the recording quality, Don. They affect whether I can see you watching me, which is what I'm trying to eliminate." And Don said he would turn them off, and Frank Sinatra stood up from the floor and straightened his jacket and moved to the microphone. And Don went back to the booth, and the engineer settled at his console, and Frank Sinatra said through the talkback, "Play the intro back so I have the tempo, and then cut it, and I'll come in on my own." And the engineer played back the orchestral introduction from one of the earlier takes, and Frank Sinatra listened to it once through, and then said okay, and the engineer cut it, and the studio was entirely silent, and Frank Sinatra stood at the microphone with the booth lights dark, so the booth glass reflected the studio back at him rather than showing him the faces of the people inside. And there was a moment that lasted perhaps 10 seconds where nothing happened, where Frank Sinatra simply stood in the silence without beginning, and then he began. The take lasted 3 minutes and 14 seconds, and nobody in the control booth said anything during any of it, and when it ended the silence came back, the third kind of silence, the processing kind, and this time it lasted almost a full minute before Don Costa pressed the intercom button and said, "That's it," in a voice that was careful and specific, and that Frank Sinatra recognized as the voice of someone who had just heard the thing they had been working toward, and was making sure to say so with enough clarity that it could not be misunderstood. And Frank Sinatra said, "Play it back." And they did. And Frank Sinatra stood in the studio listening to his own voice come back at him through the monitors, and felt something that he did not name, but that was in the neighborhood of recognition. The specific sensation of having finally arrived at the place a song had been asking him to arrive at, and when the playback finished he said, "That's the one," and Don said, "Yes." And the session ended at 3 in the morning with the tape reels boxed and labeled, and the studio returning to the silence it kept between occupations. The recording of "The End of a Love Affair" was released as part of an album the following year, and was described by several reviewers using language that circled around the same quality without quite naming it. Words like unguarded and direct and true to its own feeling. And one reviewer wrote that it sounded like a man alone in a room rather than a man in a studio performing a song about being alone in a room, which was the closest anyone came to describing what the difference was between that take and the ones that had preceded it. The difference between managing the emotional content of a performance and allowing the emotional content to manage you. And Frank Sinatra read these reviews in his suite at the Sands Hotel in Las Vegas during a residency that fall and felt the specific satisfaction of recognition, of having made something that communicated what he had intended it to communicate, which was not the most common outcome in a career full of recordings, was in fact the outcome that justified everything else, all the ordinary sessions and the functional takes and the recordings that were exactly as good as they looked on paper, because those were the necessary conditions for the occasional recording that was something other than what it looked like on paper. That was the thing the song had been asking to be all along. And Frank Sinatra understood that the distance between those two kinds of recordings was not a distance that could be traveled through effort or technique, or any of the measurable qualities of craft, but only through the specific willingness to sit on the floor of an empty studio at 2 in the morning and remember what a singer in a forgotten club in Hoboken had done in 1935 to make a room go quiet, and then to stand up and try to do it again.